I remember my friend drunkenly mumbling at me, "She's behind you, she's behind you." I didn't think too much of it at the time, but I should have. I should have grabbed my friend and left. If I had, then perhaps things would have been much different, and maybe the nightmares would have never started. I was in my freshman year at college in Washington, and I was finding it challenging. So when my roommate invited me to go along to San Diego for spring break, I immediately agreed. I was craving warm weather, and I couldn't wait to forget about studying for finals for a few weeks and just have fun. There were 7 of us staying in an Airbnb beach house. It was pretty secluded, but also close to the action. Honestly, those first few days were a blur, ones induced by all-night partying and a lot of alcohol. I got to the point where I needed a day free of drinking, partying, and anything like that. I found a quiet spot on the beach and spent the day lying on a recliner and reading in the shade. At one point, a group of college students walked past me. Given their crumpled clothes and tangled hair, they looked like they'd been out all night, and they were joking around with each other. Then I noticed someone walking behind them, a young woman with long dark hair in a sundress that dragged on the sand. She was clutching something in her arms, a book. But it wasn't your ordinary textbook. This one was large and had a worn leather binding. I couldn't help but look at her as she seemed so out of place among the others. Even beneath the beating sun, she was unusually pale. Suddenly she turned and looked at me, and as our eyes met, her mouth curled into a foreboding smile before she trailed after the group. I diverted my gaze, but when I looked over at the group again, the woman had disappeared. I went back to relaxing and didn't think that much more about her. Although later on, when my friend asked me about my day, I told her about the group of college students and that weird woman. A few days later, my friends decided to throw a beach party. They invited a bunch of people, and a couple hours into the party, it was so crowded that it was getting hard not to bump into people. I was watching a game of beer pong in the yard when my friend ran over to me. She was clearly drunk as she almost tumbled over, but even so, I could tell something had freaked her out. She kept on peering over her shoulder as if she was expecting to see someone she didn't want to. I led her inside, poured her a glass of water, and asked her if she was okay. I remember the fear in her eyes as she leaned over, grabbed my arm, and said, "She's behind you! She's behind you!" I looked around, but the scene was just full of drunk students partying. I just didn't know what she was blabbering about. Then before I could ask her any more about it, she disappeared into the crowd. I didn't see her again for hours. Then at about 3 a.m., when the party was slowly dying down, I went outside to get some fresh air, and I heard these strange sounds coming from further along the beach. They sounded like muffled sobs. I had this bad feeling, but I still walked over there. The recliner I'd been on earlier came into view, but I noticed someone was lying on it, and someone else was hovering over them. I saw that the person on the recliner had on orange wedge sandals, the exact ones my friend had been wearing. It was my friend. Then the person hovering over her turned around, and my heart pounded in horror. It was the same woman from the beach. She was clutching the same book to her chest with one arm, and in her other hand was a black piece of chalk. Upon seeing me, she gave me the same creepy smile and then walked straight past me. I didn't try to stop her from leaving at that point. I was more concerned with checking on my friend. But as I knelt next to her, I noticed that she was knocked out cold, and these strange symbols were drawn all over her arms, bare shoulder, legs, and face. I managed to get her to gain consciousness, then I led her inside. The next day when I asked her about that woman, she said she couldn't remember a thing about last night. We were all freaked out after that, so we left that same day. What's worse, my friend said that was when she started getting nightmares all the time. Still to this day, I don't know what the deal was with the strange woman, the book, or why she drew symbols all over my friend. I just hope the nightmares end for her too. I just wish I'd gotten my friend out of there when I had the chance. Who wears a puffy winter coat when it's 90 degrees outside, right? That should have been a big red flag that something wasn't right, but at the time, foolishly ignored it. I used to work in a bar in Miami. Spring break was one of the busiest and craziest times of the year, especially during our party theme nights. The venue reached full capacity quickly, so as a result, it was common for people to line up outside before opening hours. It had been a scorching hot day, and most of the people lined up were in beachwear, shades, hats, that sort of thing. They all seemed in good spirits as I walked past them to go through the side entrance into the venue. Before I went inside, I peered across the road and I saw a guy on the sidewalk. Strangely, he was wearing a puffy coat and leather boots and was just kind of standing there, directly in the sun. He was staring over at me. I found this kind of weird and didn't know how he could stand the heat. Work was completely crazy. It passed by in a daze full of serving drinks, pouring shots, cleaning up spills, and sweeping up broken glass. I don't even know what time it was when I finally finished and got to leave, but it was beginning to get light outside. I only lived 10 minutes away from the bar, so I always walked to and from work. As I walked home along the sidewalk, I looked around and noticed someone standing on the other side of the sidewalk. It was that same man from before, the one in the puffy coat and leather boots. He was just standing there with his hands in his pockets, staring directly at me. This made me feel really uncomfortable, so I quickened my pace. Given the early hour, no one else was around, but it wasn't long before I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy ones, only caused by boots. I felt myself shiver in dread, and even though I knew exactly who the footsteps belonged to, I made myself turn and look. As I feared, that weird man was hurrying toward me, his hands still in his pockets. I didn't know what else to do other than walk faster. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but it was hard to do that while hurrying at the same time, and I ended up dropping it. I knew I didn't have time to stop and grab it since he would have caught up to me, so I started running. When I peered over my shoulder, I saw him further along on the sidewalk. It looked like he was pulling something out of his pocket. Since I was familiar with this area, I knew there was an alley up ahead that looked like it had a dead end at casual glance, but when you got further along it, there was actually a narrow pathway to get out. I just couldn't run fast anymore, so I headed toward that alley, but instead of going through the gap, I hid behind a dumpster and gripped my hands over my mouth to silence my frantic gasps. It wasn't long before I heard the heavy-booted footsteps again. I heard them stop at the end of the alley. Then I heard him swear in this enraged tone. It was a terrifying moment, wondering if he would end up finding me or not. When his footsteps finally sounded off toward the pathway, I was so relieved. I stayed there for a long time just to be sure he had gone. Then I eventually stepped out from there and saw a handwritten note laying on the ground where the man had stood. I picked up the note and opened it, my mind filled with dread at what he could have possibly written. It said, "Thanks for the pour. Next time I won't be so patient." I hurried home and told my roommate what had happened. She told me to call the cops while she got her boyfriend to go and look for my phone, but I knew it was long gone. I don't know if that man took it or someone else. The cops weren't any help either, saying they couldn't find anyone nearby that matched his description. I don't know what would have happened to me if that weird guy with a jacket had found me. Then again, I don't want to know. But one thing I've learned is to watch out for any crazies wearing jackets on spring break. It was the last few days of spring break, and I decided to be impulsive and bought a last-minute ticket to Cancun to join my friends there. I thought it'd be full of tequila, day drinking, and pool parties. But instead, it turned into a nightmare. My flight was delayed, so by the time I arrived at the Airbnb, I was exhausted, but my buddies were hyped and ready to go out. They insisted that I go out with them. I didn't want to let them down or be a vibe killer, so I agreed and got in the taxi with them. We hit the bars, and after downing more tequilas than I can remember on an empty stomach, I didn't feel so good. I decided to leave and go get some food. I think it was a combination of the travel, the humidity, and the alcohol, but I ended up feeling dizzy, the kind of messed up dizziness where distorted shapes were everywhere. In my disoriented state, I ended up stumbling away from the bars into this quiet rundown area. There were a few men up ahead. One of them was leaning against a beat-up motorcycle. I saw them looking at me, but I felt so sick I didn't pay any attention. I ended up sitting on a bench with my head in my hands and hoping for the dizziness to pass. I heard footsteps and voices. They were speaking Spanish, so I had no idea what they were saying. I looked up to see who it was and saw one of the men in front of me. He was waving his arms around. At first, I thought he was probably just asking me what I was doing there, but even though I didn't know what he was saying, I understood the urgency in his voice. I shook my head, told him I didn't speak Spanish, and said I was going. He continued waving his arms around and talking. I made out one word, habitación. He kept on saying it over and over again. I got the hint and knew I needed to get out of there, so I forced myself onto my feet and brushed past him. But as I went to walk away, he grabbed my arm with a firm, unfaltering grip. I tried shrugging him off me, but he had a really strong grip. Then I heard the sounds of a motorcycle and saw the other man riding towards us. He came to a screeching stop in front of us. The next part played out like an actual horror movie sequence. The man gripping my arm tried shoving me onto the back of the motorcycle. That's when I saw it on the side of the back seat. A metal chain. They were trying to chain me to the bike. I thought this was it and they were going to take me away somewhere and try to harvest my organs or something. I must have had a surge of adrenaline as I managed to swing at them enough to prevent them from locking me up in that chain. Then suddenly, I heard shouting coming from up ahead. This seemed to spook the men, and they let me go. The other man jumped onto the back of the motorcycle, and they sped off. It turns out the shouting was coming from the employees of the bar who'd heard the commotion and came out to see what was going on. They called the police and stayed with me until they showed up. I also managed to call my buddies and tell them what happened. They found me and took me back to the apartment. I now know that habitación means something like hotel room in Spanish. I just don't know why that man kept on repeating it, and what room it was they wanted to take me to. All I do know is that if those people hadn't shown up when they did, then chances are those men would have managed to chain me to the motorcycle, and then, well, I know I dodged a serious bullet that day, because the thought of what could have happened to me fills me with dread.